Well, morning, church. Hey, if we have not had a chance to meet yet, my name is Doug. I'm one of the pastors here. And this morning, we're going to be continuing a series that we've been in for the past few weeks. For the past few weeks, we've been talking about one of the most famous guys in the entire Bible, a guy by the name of David, who went from being an unknown shepherd boy tending his father's sheep in a podunk little town called Bethlehem to becoming the king over all of ancient Israel. And this morning, we're going to finish our series by looking at the last few years of David's life, which unfortunately was a season marked by hardship and pain and loss. His health was failing. His family was falling apart. His kingdom was being threatened by external enemies and internal rivals. And then on top of that, he ended up having to bury 3 of his own children, all of whom died under really tragic circumstances. And even though you and I may not be in charge of an entire kingdom like David was, most of us know what it's like to have a lot of things go wrong at once, don't we? It rarely does it feel like it's just one thing. Usually it feels like it's one thing stacked on top of another thing, stacked on top of another thing. I was talking with a friend of mine named Eddie this week, and Eddie's on our staff team. He's actually back in the booth right now, mixing for this service, and he was talking about just something that had happened earlier in the week. So he'd had a bunch of family come into town to stay with him for the week, and so he was there, his mom was there, his son and daughter-in-law and 4 grandkids were all there, so 8 people in a 2-bedroom house hanging out for the week, right? What could go wrong? And he's here at work and he gets a call from his mom. Hey, Eddie, something's wrong with the sink. I was putting some cantaloupe rinds down the sink. Yeah. Anyway, putting some cantaloupe rinds on, and now the water won't go down. It's stuck. It's backed up. So anyway, okay, all right, I'll come home. And Eddie's a pretty handy guy, right? So he gets underneath there and disconnects everything and kind of cleans everything out, puts it all back together again, and runs some water, expecting the water to go back down, to run just fine. And it didn't. It was backed up. Not only that, but now the sink in the back of the house is backed up and water's bubbling up out of that sink. Then the bathroom sink is now not working. Then the toilet begins to bubble. So you got 8 people, you got 4 adults, 4 kids, and no toilets. That is a recipe for a disaster, right? So some days are just like that, right? Where it just seems like not just one thing goes wrong, but one thing on top of another, on top of another, and on top of another. And some days, let's be honest, some days are way worse than just a backed up toilet. 2 weeks ago, I did a funeral for a husband and wife who died within a couple of months of each other. And just a few days after the funeral, I got a call from one of the daughters who called me to let her know that her father-in-law had now just passed away and her sister was in the hospital and might not make it. Just overwhelmed. It wasn't just one thing. It was one thing and then another thing and then another thing and another thing. I was praying just a few weeks ago with a woman in our church who was mourning the loss of her daughter who had died from a drug overdose, and then she informed me that her son had just been killed. If it's not one thing, it's another on top of another on top of another. And most of us in this room know what that feels like. To varying degrees, different experiences, different circumstances, different situations, but we know what that's like when it's not just one thing, it's one thing stacked on top of another, on top of another. And so the question in those seasons and those moments becomes, what do we do? Like, how do we navigate that? How do we get through that? What do we do when everything goes wrong all at once? This morning, we're going to look at what David did. We're going to look at what David did, and after we look at what David did in the scriptures, we're actually going to try putting it into practice together. So if you have a Bible with you this morning or a Bible app, I'm going to invite you to turn to 2 Samuel chapter 22. 2 Samuel chapter 22. If you don't have a Bible, it's going to be on the screen behind me, so you'll be able to follow along. But we've been reading through sections of 1 and 2 Samuel as we've been tracing the life of David through the scriptures. And as you turn to 2 Samuel 22, let me give you a quick 2-minute summary of what we've learned about David's life so far in this series. So you may remember that when we first started this series, we looked at Israel's first king, a guy by the name of King Saul, who repeatedly disobeyed God. And so what did God do? God chose a new king, a young shepherd boy named David. And even though David didn't become king right away, he did become quite famous when he fought and killed a giant Philistine warrior named Goliath with nothing but a slingshot, which, if you know the story, you know caused King Saul to become so jealous of David's growing popularity and success that he tried to kill David, tried to kill him multiple times, eventually forcing David to escape into the desert where he lived for almost 15 years. But eventually, after years and years, more than a decade of running for his life and hiding from King Saul dies in battle, in a battle with their enemies, the Philistines, and David finally became king. And once David became king, he did three things right out of the gate. Number one, he captured the city of Jerusalem and built a lavish palace for himself there. Two, he moved the ark of the Lord into the city of Jerusalem. And then three, he conquered many of Israel's enemies. So things were kind of headed up and to the right in David's life. He's finally king. He's got a palace. He's got a kingdom. He's defeating enemies. Things are going well. Everything's moving in the right direction. He's got momentum on his side. And it's here that David's story begins to unravel. Because if you remember from a couple of weeks ago, if you were here, you'll remember that this is the point where, in David's story, where he stayed home from battle. He spied on a woman named Bathsheba while she was bathing in her home. He took advantage of her. He got her pregnant, and then he had her husband killed to cover up his own actions. And when you're reading the story, when you're reading through 2 Samuel chapter 11, you get to the end of that part of the story, and it almost seems like David got away with it because nothing really happens to David in 2 Samuel chapter 11. But we looked at 2 Samuel chapter 12 last week, and we saw that the prophet Nathan confronted David, appropriately so, confronted David, spoke truth to power, we might say, and confronted David about his sin. David finally came clean. He confessed his sin both to Nathan and to God. And so last week, we talked about the idea that sin, David's sin and our own sin, has consequences, inescapable consequences, which is exactly what we see play out in the last half of David's life. Because from that moment forward, David's life was filled with the direct and the indirect consequences of his actions. In 2 Samuel chapter 13, we find out that one of David's sons named Amnon sexually assaulted his own sister named Tamar. And even though David was furious about what was happening in his family, he didn't do anything about it. He took no action. And so Tamar's brother Absalom decided to take matters into his own hands and kill his half-brother Amnon for what he had done to Tamar, which resulted in David banishing Absalom, which made Absalom so bitter that he conspired against his father, staged a coup, and usurped his father's throne. So by the time we get to 2 Samuel chapter 15, David is now back on the run, just like he was earlier in his life. Only this time, he's not on the run from King Saul. He's on the run from his own son, his own flesh and blood, his own son Absalom, who's trying to kill him and take over the kingdom. And by the time the dust settles on this season of David's life, Absalom has been killed. David has wept and mourned his son's death. A rebel named Sheba has staged another attempted coup. The nation has endured a 3-year famine. David was almost killed during a battle with the Philistines. His health began to fail. Another one of his sons named Adonijah tried to take the throne. And then finally, towards the end of his life, David was forced to intervene and name one of his other sons, Solomon, as the successor. And I don't know about you, but reading all of that transpired in David's life makes me feel overwhelmed. It actually makes me feel bad for David. I mean, I know he brought some of this on himself through his own actions and his own inactions, but man, this is a rough stretch for David. There's just no other way to describe it, but David's final years were really, really hard, which makes what David does in chapter 22, which is where we're going to read in just a moment. It makes what David does in chapter 22 even more surprising. When we understand what was going on in David's life and the turmoil and the struggles and the challenges, when we understand what was happening in his life, it makes what he does in chapter 22 really surprising. Because in the middle of all that pain and all of that suffering and all of that loss, David wrote a song. He wrote a song that's recorded for us here in 2 Samuel chapter 22. It actually also shows up in the book of Psalms as Psalm 18. So if you read those two next to each other, you'll see they're almost identical. And this morning I want to read the first 20 verses of 2 Samuel chapter 22 together. I'll read it out loud and you can follow along. But this is David's song that's plopped right down in the middle of all that stuff that was going on in David's life. Let's see what he wrote. It says this: David sang to the Lord the words of this song when the Lord delivered him from the hand of all his enemies and the hand of Saul. He said, and this is David's song, "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge, my shield and the horn of my salvation. He is my stronghold, my refuge, and my savior. From violent people you save me." He says, "I called to the Lord who is worthy of praise, and I've been saved from my enemies. The waves of death swirled around me. The torrents of destruction overwhelmed me. The cords of the grave coiled around me. The snares of death confronted me." And he says, "In my distress, I called to the Lord. I called out to my God." And what did God do? It says, "From his temple, he heard my voice. My cry came to his ears. The earth trembled and quaked. The foundations of the heavens shook. They trembled because God was angry. Smoke rose from his nostrils. Consuming fire came from his mouth. Burning coals blazed out of it. He parted the heavens and he came down. Dark clouds were under his feet. He mounted the cherubim and flew. He soared on the wings of the wind. He made darkness his canopy around him, the dark rain clouds on the sky. Out of the brightness of his presence, bolts of lightning blazed forth. The Lord thundered from heaven. The voice of the Most High resounded. He shot his arrows and scattered the enemy. With great bolts of lightning, he routed them. And the valley of the seas were exposed, and the foundations of the earth laid bare at the rebuke of the Lord, at the blast of breath from his nostrils." Verse 17, "He reached down from on high, and he took hold of me. He drew me out of deep waters. He rescued me from my powerful enemy, from my foes who were too strong for me. They confronted me in the day of my disaster, but the Lord was my support. He brought me into a spacious place, and he rescued me because he delighted in me." Let's stop there. Friends, for almost 3,000 years, the words of this song have brought comfort and encouragement to literally to billions of people who have read these words or heard these words read or sung. And my hope this morning, as we look a little bit more closely at these words and what was going on with David, my hope is that they bring some hope and encouragement and comfort for us today. But there's two things that I want to point out about what we just read, about the passage that we just read. First of all, I want to make it really clear that what we just read is poetry. It's not meant to be read literally. It's an example of rich Hebrew poetry filled with figurative language and vivid imagery that David uses to describe God. In other words, smoke doesn't literally come out of God's nostrils. He doesn't literally breathe fire out of his mouth, right? He's not a dragon, right? He doesn't live in a temple. He's not confined to a temple where he has to listen to the voices of humans really closely in order to be able to hear what they say way down on earth, right? This is figurative language. He doesn't cause earthquakes when he's angry. He doesn't shoot lightning bolts out of his fists, right? These are all examples of, again, what's called figurative language. And David uses these images to describe the ways that God has protected him and rescued him from his trials and tribulations. So it's the first thing that we need to notice, that this is poetry, beautiful, rich Hebrew poetry filled with figurative language about God. The second thing that I want to point out is that 2 Samuel chapter 22 is an example of something that in Hebrew is called zachar. And the word zachar technically means to remember something or to recall an event. But in the Hebrew tradition, it means way more than that. It has a deeper meaning than just that. See, when we think of what it means to remember something, we typically think of recalling information, right? The way that our phone or a computer sort of recalls a file, right? The information's in there, and our phone or the computer just has to find it really quick and then spit it out on the screen. And that's kind of the way that we think of this idea of remembering, right? My wife loves to play trivia, and she's really, really good at trivia, and I'm terrible. Not because I don't know stuff, I just can't think of the stuff that I know. Some of you are like that. We're like, I know that I know that. I know that I read that. I know that I watched that movie. I know that I know the lyrics of that song. Oh my gosh, who sings that song, right? And you're trying to bring it up, and you're trying to bring, am I the only one that's like this, or no? Some of you are like this too. Okay, so my wife just has it quick. They ask the question, she knows the answer. They ask the question, and then she looks at me and I'm like, I know that, but I can't think of it. And she's like, you want a hint? I'm like, no, I don't want a hint. I want to figure it out. But I always joke that like my brain is like an old guy in the back file room thumbing through the files, trying to find the information. Nope, not in that drawer. Let me look in this drawer, right? I'm like, hurry up. Anyway, but in the language of the Old Testament, to zachar something meant more than just to recall the information, just to sort of bring up the data. It means reliving the event in a way that influences the present. Let me share with you how one author puts it. I'm going to try to explain this because it actually causes this to really pop and come alive. So let me share how one author puts it. He says, in our modern post-Enlightenment age, we've been formed to think of remembering as a cognitive discipline, right? Something that just kind of happens in our brain, a cognitive discipline, right? We slow down and we bring to mind past events so that we don't forget them. Oh, that's what happened. Oh, that's right. That's where we were. This is certainly true and valuable, but the ancient Jewish understanding of remembrance went much deeper. Skye Jitani says this, he says, in the culture of the Psalms, remembrance was more than just the mental recollection of past events. Rather, it was the recollection of an event so that the power of that event could be experienced in the present. It was a recollection of an event so that the power of that event, that thing that happened, that thing that God did, that thing that I experienced could be felt, could be experienced in the future. Not just a mental exercise, but I'm putting myself back in that situation. I'm remembering what it was like. I'm remembering what it felt like. I'm remembering what I experienced. I'm remembering God's faithfulness. And it's actually having a powerful effect on me now, how I'm thinking, how I'm responding, how I'm reacting. Another author, another scholar says it this way. He says, the act of remembering was not merely cognitive, but involved a commitment to act in accordance with what was remembered. So in other words, the act of zachar, of remembering and putting yourself into a past situation actually had impact on how you behave and how you live in the present. Let me give you another example. My wife and I, several years ago, we were out for Valentine's Day. And we were at a restaurant here in town called Rumfish y Vino. And we're sitting out there, there's this beautiful kind of outdoor patio area, and we're sitting there and we're having conversation, and we look over and there's a couple, they're a little bit older than us. This is Valentine's Day, bear in mind. It's like the romance holiday, right? And so it's this couple that's sitting there, a little bit older than us, and he's leaned back with his phone in his hand, and she's leaned back with her phone in her hand. Valentine's Day, Rumfish y Vino, it's not a cheap place, right? And they're sitting there just on their phones, no conversation, no eye contact, not really experiencing each other. And so my wife and I kind of made a commitment to each other after that evening that wouldn't be us. It's so easy, right, to sort of slip into that, but we didn't want that to be us. And so we started doing a thing on anniversaries and Valentine's Day dinners. If we go out, we do this thing where we kind of alternate back and forth, recalling things that we had done together in the past, things that we enjoyed, or a place we went, or a moment we experienced together, or something that we had done together. Oh, remember when we went to, oh, remember that time when where was that? And we kind of go back and forth, and we just trade memories back and forth. And it prevents a lull in the conversation, right? We just kind of keep the conversation going, and I'll share a memory, and then she'll share a memory, and then I'll share a memory, and it kind of takes us down the path where we start reliving the event. Oh my gosh, that was that one beach, right? And we went down those stairs, and then there was, oh my gosh, those people, remember? And we just sort of like relive the memory, and we immerse ourselves in that memory. And what's beautiful about it is by reliving those past experiences together, those memories actually cause us to feel closer and more connected in the present, right? It's not just a mental thing that we're doing that has roots in the past. We're actually like bringing those experiences of the past into the present. That affects and influences the way that we feel about each other, the way that we treat each other. Those memories lead to action. We do this when we reminisce. We hear a song. We smell a smell. We go back to a place and we remember someone, something, and it transports us, and it has power in the present. See, this is how the Old Testament concept of zakar works. It doesn't simply mean to recall information. It means to relive the past in a way that reshapes and influences the present. And that's what David is doing here in 2 Samuel chapter 22. He's not just reminding himself of past events. He's reliving those events. He's immersing himself in those past experiences of God's faithfulness in a way that helps him find hope and encouragement that he needs now to face his present circumstances. This is why he begins by saying things like, the Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer. My God is my rock in whom I take refuge. He's my shield. He's the horn of my salvation. That's a symbol of strength. He's my stronghold, my refuge, and my Savior, David says. And what is he doing? He's rehearsing the past faithfulness of God. He's reminding himself of all the times in the past that God saved him, all the times that God protected him, all the times that God defended him, all the times that God delivered him and rescued him. But he's not simply recalling those events, he's reliving them in the present. He's closing his eyes and remembering what God had done. He's putting himself back in those circumstances and remembering God's hand in his life. What it felt like for God to be his rock, his fortress, his deliverer. What it felt like for God to be his stronghold, his refuge, his Savior. What it felt like when God swooped down, using his words, from the heavens and rescued him from his enemies. What it felt like when the waves of death swirled about him and the torrents of destruction overwhelmed him and the cords of the grave coiled around him. What it felt like when the Lord pulled him up out of the deep, overwhelming waters and set him down on what he says is a spacious place, warm, dry land. And by reliving his past experiences of God's faithfulness, they began to reshape the way that David experienced his present. It gave him strength. It gave him hope. It seems as though it filled him with a renewed faith to face the new challenges that were swirling around him. And so, friends, that's what we're going to do this morning. We're actually going to put this into practice together, this Hebrew idea of zakar. Let me explain. In just a moment, I'm going to step down off the stage, and I'm going to invite all of us in the room to just sit with our eyes closed. For those joining us online, to do the same thing, to just sit with our eyes closed for a moment. And I'm going to invite you to just think of a time in your life that God has helped you, protected you, or rescued you. Just think back to a season, a day, a moment, a period of time in your life, an experience, something that you walked through, that God rescued you, or he helped you, or he strengthened you, or he protected you. And so what we're gonna do then is we're just gonna sit with that memory and just kind of immerse ourselves in that memory and remember the faithfulness of God, and just let that begin to lead to thankfulness and gratefulness, and gratitude and praise. And then Josh is going to lead us in a final song. So at this point, I'm just going to invite you to go ahead and close your eyes. Just close your eyes. Just think of a time that God has helped you, protected you, or rescued you. Immerse yourself in that memory and just begin to thank him for his faithfulness.